This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 511, entitled, "If you monoconscious feminists don't become biconscious, we biconscious masculists will bite your fucking heads off." Description. This flyer expresses the contempt and hatred that biconscious masculists have against the hypocritical, myopic, sexist, gynocentric, solipsistic monoconsciousness of feminists, lashing out at them, telling them that women oppress men far worse with their decades-lasting gender crimes against men, the worst being women's decades-lasting manslavery of men at the hands of the hated manslaving fluffies, who don't bother becoming FIPs, who expect to live off a man's money and labour for decades of a man's life, which is a war issue to masculists who see manslavery as a greater war issue than negro slavery, given that there are billions of man-slaves in the world today. For itself. If you monoconscious feminists don't become biconscious, we biconscious masculists will bite your fucking heads off. By Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Biconscious masculists are getting really pissed off with the bigoted, sexist, hypocritical ignorance and misandry of the monoconscious feminists, and lash out at them whenever we come across them, showing them in no uncertain terms our contempt and hatred of them for their massive hypocrisy and the genocidal damage they are doing to society, so deserve our hatred. If you are unfamiliar with the above ideas, then consider why masculists, that is, biconscious masculists, in brackets, that is, who have had both their feminist and their masculist consciousnesses raised, close brackets, feel the way they do towards MFBs, that's monoconscious feminazi bigots. I'll start with a monoconscious feminist viewpoint, since it is much more familiar to people in general, since society has been exposed to monoconscious feminist views for nearly 6 decades. Since feminists have had a monopoly over gender politics for all that time. It's only recently that masculist ideas have surfaced, so most people, and virtually all feminists, are not familiar with them, and this has consequences, as this flyer spells out explicitly. From a monoconscious feminist viewpoint, that is, from the viewpoint of a woman who knows nothing about masculism, who has been brainwashed all her life that gender oppression is a one-way street, close brackets, it is men who are the oppressors and women who are the oppressed, the victims of men's oppression, for example, rape, sexual harassment, domestic violence, unequal rights, glass ceiling, etc. And not surprisingly, she is angry at men, since this is what feminism teaches her. After 6 decades of this, many feminists feel that they have the right to express their feminist anger at men for the ways that men oppress women, and they do express it. That is, women have become increasingly misandrist and feminazi bitchy at men, especially young women, who typically have a rather condescending attitude towards men, and have no patience with their young male work colleagues if these men express negative opinions regarding women. All this is old hat to feminists, that is, monoconscious feminists. But those 6 decades of feminist monopoly of gender politics are now over, because men now have their own gender political ideology, their own ism, called masculism, which preaches that gender oppression is definitely a two-way street, and that in fact women oppress men far worse than vice versa, since many of women's gender crimes against men last decades, and hence are far more serious than the gender crimes committed by men against women. The real battleground between the sexes are the divorce courts, where one father in 4 gets financially massacred and has his life ruined. The massive gender injustice committed by the hated, that is by masculists, fluffy feminist hypocrite genociders who control the divorce courts has caused 2/3 of young men in many countries now to reject marriage and paternity due to the toxicity of divorce created by these hated fluffy feminists who masculists see as both hypocrites and genociders. In brackets, a fluffy, based on the word fluff, is a masculist label for a traditional woman who expects to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man for decades of his life, thus manslaving him, a huge gender crime in the eyes of the masculists. Close brackets. Monoconscious feminists, by definition, have only had their feminist consciousnesses raised. They know nothing about masculist ideas, so by default they still have traditional expectations of men. They have not yet been masculisted, and being women, that is, with their 10% smaller brains, their greatly inferior track record, re-science Nobel Prizes, etc., are not very imaginative, so tend to remain rather conservative when it comes to their expectations of men. The vast majority of women, for example, have a deeply ingrained expectation that, in quotes, men exist on this earth to pay for women to have babies. The fluffy feminists took control of the divorce courts in the 70s and brought with them their monoconscious feminist anger at men and their traditional expectations of men, and thus made the divorce courts a slaughterhouse for men, stripping custody of a man's kids away from him with a 90% probability. Young men saw what happened to their fathers, their uncles, their older male friends, and came to the obvious conclusion that modern marriage sucks for men. So they say to themselves, quote, fuck marriage, fuck paternity, I'll spend my money on myself, I'll live the MGTOW, that's men going their own way, lifestyle. I won't marry, I won't have kids, and I'll do what I like with my own money. I'm not going to tolerate a 1 in 4 chance of being financially crucified by a hated, fluffy feminist controlled divorce court. End quote. Many MGTOWs are so pissed off with the female psychology that they don't even sex women, choosing to live the lifestyle of the MGTOW monk. This decision of millions of young men around the world to not marry and have kids makes perfect sense when they reason that if they have a 1 in 4 chance of losing his kids, then why have them at all? A 1 in 4 chance is utterly, in capital letters, unacceptable. The divorce courts are now calvaries for married fathers. They lose custody of their kids with a 90% probability, as stated above. They will lose their house to his ex-wife so that she can raise her kids in it. He'll be forced to pay her for child support for his kids whom he will barely be allowed to see. He will lose half his wealth and half his stuff to her. If his divorcing wife is a real fluffy, he may be forced to pay her alimony for the rest of his life, with no moral nor legal obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and FIP up, so she remains a parasite after him after the divorce the way she was before the divorce. To monoconscious feminists, the above seems perfectly natural to them, since their expectation of men is that men are the cash machines in a marriage. So when a divorce comes, the man, the ex-husband, simply continues to play that cash machine role. But to masculists, this is manslavery. To have your masculist consciousness raised is essentially to see fluffydom as manslavery and manslavery as slavery, and hence to be hated, and is a war issue. So one of the fundamental political goals of the masculists is the creation of a FIP society in which both sexes, especially young women, are socialized by parents and educated by teachers to become FIPs, that's financially independent persons, who bother to get career competent educations at high school and college so they become FIPs as adults and not expect to live the fluffy lifestyle, parasiting off a man and manslaving him for decades of his life. Damascus, manslavery is a far bigger problem than was Negro slavery in the US in the 1800s, which led to the US Civil War. The root cause of that war was the immorality of Negro slavery that the northern state abolitionists saw as so abominable that they were prepared to go to war against the southern states to stop it. Masculists see several billion man-slaves on the planet today, so see man-slavery as a hugely greater issue than Negro slavery, so have a real hatred, a burning, massive injustice type hatred against man-slaving fluffies, and an even greater hatred against the fluffy feminist hypocrites who control the divorce courts. Masculists see these fluffy feminists as hypocrites because as feminists they want equal rights with men in the parliaments, which the masculists have no problems with, but reject equal obligations with men to share equally the burden of earning the living with men by not bothering to get career competent educations, thus manslaving men for decades. Masculists argue that it was men who liberated women from household drudgery by giving women science-based medicine so that women now have a life expectancy of 85 years, hence a career window of half a century. Masculists argue that now that women can work, they must work, since anything else is manslavery, and in time, manslavery will get women killed. It was men who gave women the pill. So women now choose to have 0, 1 or 2 kids in most cases. Men gave women household gadgets, higher education. So as stated above, women now have a career window of half a century, so have a powerful moral obligation to get off their fat parasitic asses and FIP up, or be powerfully punished by men by not getting one. Masculists see fluffy feminists also as indirect genociders, since they have made divorce and hence marriage and paternity so toxic for men that 2/3 and growing of young men in many countries now reject marriage, reject paternity. And this crashes the birth rate, which is now wiping out whole populations, given the numbers. But these MGTOWing men are merely reacting against the toxicity of the hated fluffy feminist controlled divorce courts. So the root cause of the crash in the birth rate and the wiping out of whole populations are the fluffy feminists, whom the masculists see as indirect genociders, so they have to be stopped with bullets if necessary in a sex war. Masculists have the same hatred of manslavery as 1800s US abolitionists had against Negro slavery. Masculists aim to wipe out fluffies and fluffy feminists, our two greatest enemies, and we do that by simply ignoring such women, refusing to have relationships with them, and not giving them our sperm. As masculists, we tell young women, who are now increasingly panicking as they notice with boyfriend after boyfriend that he refuses to give her his sperm, arguing that marriage and paternity are too dangerous for men, so he prefers to just pump and dump women, but never to marry them nor give them babies. We masculists tell these young women that the root cause of their babylessness is the toxicity of the fluffy feminist controlled divorce courts, so that these babyless young women should learn to hate the fluffy feminists as much as men do. So soon, the fluffy feminists will be feeling the hatred coming from both sexes, so will really feel the heat and hopefully will agree to accept the men-faring reforms in the divorce courts needed to make marriage and paternity far less toxic for men. This is the end of part 1.